Welcome to Americana Archives. Today we have part 7, the last installment of the story with the headline, Indian War History. The subheadline says, Reminiscences of Old Strike the Ree, Old Dakota, and their contemporaries in the early part of the present century. This article was written by Creep Easy of Calamity Farm. It says, we will now return to Old Dakota and Williams, who left Heart River for the fur company's rendezvous on the Cheyenne, where they arrived in due time, without mishap or adventure. This place continued to be a rallying point for a multifarious and motley population, and was at that time a great place of arrival and departure for trappers and traders, engaged in the fur trade. Here, after an absence of a year, they came in with their peltries and furs, and settled their accounts with the company, the furs rendered by them being transported by steamboat to St. Louis. Here was also congregated a class of trappers and hunters, technically called free trappers, in the language of the traders, who had been employed by the fur company, but their term of service having expired, continued to hunt and trap on their own account, trading with the company like Indians. They derived the appellation of free trappers to distinguish them from the trappers who were furnished and bound by the company to work for them for a year or more and receive wages or trapped on shares. These wanderers of the wilderness, having frequent intercourse with the Indians, and being separated from civilization, relapsed into the habitudes of the natives. Though no longer bound by engagements to continue in the pursuit of trapping, yet they had become so accustomed to it that a great portion of them would intermarry with the Indians and look back with repugnance upon the restraints of their civilized life. Having given the reader some idea of the fur trade and acquainted him with the wild chivalry of the mountains and plains of the Great West, we will no longer delay the introduction of Old Dakota with his friend Williams into the piebald mixture of civilized, half-civilized, and savage companions. Here, Old Dakota was in the full enjoyment of his wishes, leading a trapper's life in the wilderness, with all of its wild populace around him. Besides his own people, motley in character and costume, American, French, Creole, half-breed, hired, and free trapper, he was surrounded by an encampment of Cheyenne Indians whose lodges extended over hills and valleys. Old Dakota and his friend Williams reached the rendezvous about sundown and encamped on an eminence that overlooked the valley. The encampment below presented a bustling scene. The resounding strokes of the axe, the sharp report of the rifle, continual parties returning and sallying forth, all in the midst of a region that only a few days before was suddenly roused from perfect silence and loneliness by this transient trapper's sojourn, realized the idea of a populous solitude. As twilight thickened into darkness, every campfire glared upon a group of men, eating, cooking, and working at their various duties, while perhaps from some point a group of men could be seen seated around a campfire, drinking and relating their exploits and adventures. After Old Dakota and his friend had partaken of their evening meal and made everything secure for the night, they left the camp in charge of William's young Blackfoot squaw and made a tour of the encampment. One of the chief delights of these frontiersmen, especially when congregated around a campfire of an evening, was to listen to some strange and quaint wanderer who could beguile away the hours of repose with anecdotes and recollections of his past life. Those loquacious retailers of traditionary lore, who could relate strange and interesting leather-stocking tales and legends, were hailed as a fortuitous acquisition to their evening gatherings. Such a man was Old McDonald, an old weather-beaten Scotchman, who had worked in the interests of the fur company for years, who had crossed and recrossed the Rocky Mountains several times, and had trapped and hunted from the Missouri to the Pacific coast, and whose precautionary counsels were of such value that he had gained the well-merited sobriquet of Old Nestor. As Old Dakota and his companion were passing one of the campfires, they paused and listened to Old Nestor's narration of the following interesting Indian legend. Old McDonald's Story. Several years ago, while myself and a companion were traveling on the great trail that leads from the Bitterroot River to Fort Walla Walla, we passed down for the Grand Canyon into a rocky country of broken aspect to a small stream called Cragfish Creek. Continuing along the general course of that stream for 5 or 6 miles, we encamped for the night in an eminence that overlooked a small lake enclosed by high precipitous rocky bluffs and was fed by a large number of warm springs. This remarkable lake, translated from the Indian tongue signifying never freezing water, at a first glance looked as though it had no outlet. But upon a close inspection, we discovered, at a place near a point where the rocks towered aloft in jagged pinnacles, presenting to view effigies resembling men and beasts, a whirlpool where the agitated waters of the lake, after being drawn into this vortex, passed for a short distance below the earth's surface, and issuing forth from a cavern, rushed down into the Palouse River, which at that point flowed through a deep fissure in the basaltic rocks to the falls below. Below the falls, the Palouse River runs through a deep canyon for a distance of 9 miles to its junction with the Snake River. While encamped, we were visited during the evening by several Snake Indians, accompanied by their chief, Running Fisher. The home of Running Fisher's band was located near the junction of the Palouse with Snake River, where they devoted the greater portion of their time to fishing for salmon which run up Columbia and Snake Rivers, enter the mouth of the Palouse, and ascend to the falls. While visiting our camp, Running Fisher pointed to the effigies on the jagged pinnacles of rock that towered above the whirlpool in the lake and said, "These are the representatives of a race of people who inhabited this country ages ago, who were annihilated and placed there by the Great Spirit and his displeasure at their misdeeds. It is a sacred spot, where those that came on peaceable missions will not be molested, while those that come here for war and plunder will meet with the doom that was meted out to our hereditary foes that inhabited the upper country many years ago." Wishing to learn the particulars of that traditional story, I requested Running Fisher to relate it. Seating himself on a large flat rock that overlooked the clear, transparent waters of the lake, in a deep guttural tone, he narrated in the Indian tongue the following interesting legend. White Crane was the chief of a band of Yakima Indians, the remnant of a once powerful branch of the Snakes, who dwelt with his people on the waters of the Palouse River. The Blackfeet, that fierce and indomitable tribe of warlike Indians, who claimed the hunting grounds from the Bitterroot Mountains to the Missouri, took it into their heads to destroy this little band of Yakimas. Knowing the deep cunning and valor of White Crane, who during 30 years of intercourse with the Blackfeet had learned their habits and language, they chose a day when he was absent, and falling upon the inhabitants of the village unawares, they took the scalp of every warrior and carried the women and children into captivity. The war party who did this deed were 60 in number, and though successful thus far, they knew that upon their return to their native village, the squaws and old men would mock them and deny them the title of braves if they brought not in the scalp of White Crane. They therefore left 15 of their bravest men to lie in wait for the wily chief and murder him upon his return to the village. Taking a new route, the chief returned to his village to find it destroyed and desolate, and though alone, he vowed vengeance upon his persecutors. Life had lost all its charms. There was nothing left but to gain revenge and die. Knowing well that his enemies were thirsting for his blood, he thought it prudent to hide for a while until they took their departure, when he could come forth and lay his deep and hopeful plans of retaliation and revenge. With his faithful bow and his quiver full of unerring arrows, he turned to the hills to secrete himself. He moved but slowly, as he used the most careful precautions to conceal his trail, walking in the bed of running streams, until at length he found himself on a ledge of hard rock that could not leave even the most indistinct traces of human footsteps. The chief followed it. It led between two lofty hills, becoming every moment more narrow. At length he reached its termination and came out of the defile on the opposite side of the lake from where we are sitting. A sight burst upon White Crane's view, which even at that desolate moment made his heart leap with gratitude and unspeakable emotions. At his feet lay this lovely valley and lake, surrounded by its walls of impassable rock, save where he stood. A smooth lawn of green sward ran down from the crest of rock to the lake, while numerous springs, bristling and sparkling in the sunshine, trickled into the bubbling bosom of the transparent reservoir. Groves dotted the scene, which promised refreshing shelter and abundance of game. The chief walked slowly down to the banks of the lake. It was teeming with fish. In tracing his steps towards the south, he passed beneath the towering pinnacles of rocks near the whirlpool, and there discovered that a river passed beneath an overhanging arch through a cavern from the agitated waters of the lake, while at a distance was heard the dull roar of rushing waters. But nowhere did the restless eye of White Crane detect the slightest evidence to prove that mortal man had ever trod that spot. A smile of grim satisfaction passed over the warrior's face, as he determined to take up his abode there for a while, and baffle his enemies until he could reach his friends on Snake River. And then his dark eye was glistening big, with deadly meaning. He was thinking of the 50 reeking scalps of his followers and kindred, which hung up in the lodges of his hated enemies, the Blackfeet. His first care was to build himself a small and convenient hut, and to manufacture traps and fishing tackle to catch the speckled trout and fur-bearing animals. Of both, the lake and small spring creeks afforded abundance. Then, laying aside his bow and arrows, he passed out under the overhanging arch to explore the outlet from the lake, whose high, rough, and precipitous banks forbade any other mode of exit. Wading along in the shallow water for some distance, he observed that the overhanging arch of the cavern rose higher, and soon he saw the light of day from its farther side. He plunged into the stream and swam along quietly, his watchful eyes scanning every gap and fissure in the rocks, until he felt the current becoming more rapid. Coming out, he made for the bank of the stream, and clambering amid pointed rocks and loose stones, he gained a point from which he saw the junction of the stream with the river, and the gigantic falls, where the waters of the river rushed down into another equally extraordinary place. After gaining a high and prominent place for observation, the chief sat down upon a fragment of granite and gazed around him. The bed of the river below presented a singular aspect. In the middle, it was a smooth though rushing stream, while on its sides were caverns and arches and gullies, for which the mad waters fiercely bubbled, escaping through rents which its own impetuosity had carved out. White Crane advanced to the edge of the cliff and looked down into the deep valley below the falls. Then, as if satisfied with his survey, he retraced his steps, repassed under the arch of the cavern, and returned to the shores of the beautiful lake. More than a week had passed, and White Crane began to think he had baffled his enemies. There was no lack of game and fish, and every day added to his knowledge of the locality. He had profited by those fortunate circumstances. About dusk one evening, which gave signs of a stormy and disagreeable night, he sat on a flat rock on the shore of the lake, thinking of the sad fate of his people. His keen, restless eye ranged all around, and his nice ear, alive to the faintest sound, was ever listening for the footsteps of the foe. Why does he start, stand erect, and clutch his ever-faithful bow? The next instant an arrow flies from it, a loud cry is heard, and 15 dark and yelling forms were seen in the outline on the bluffs overhead, and the evening air resounded with their war whoops as they discharged a flight of arrows at their intended victim. It was the 15 Blackfeet warriors who were left by the main war party to ferret out the hiding place of White Crane. To leap into the lake and to swim underwater until his breath could be held no longer, then rise at a distance and shake his clenched fist at his pursuers, was the work of a minute. The darkness was not sufficient to hide any very palpable object from sight, and when White Crane reached the whirlpool, where the waters of the lake rushed into the cavernous passage to the river, the Blackfeet saw him drawn into the vortex, and an awful yell rent the air. The whole 15 warriors were soon running along on the land, which gave a distinct view of the river below. Another yell, half of pleasure, half of admiration, followed, as they beheld the apparently lifeless form of White Crane issue from the dark cavern and float down the stream. Wishing to capture him alive, every dark form, which a moment before was filled with bitter sensations of disappointment, now dilated with joy as they plunged in after the chief. Each man sought to be the winner of the prize. The end of the chase no longer appeared doubtful. White Crane, stunned, bruised, and bewildered, however rapidly recovered, but not so rapidly as to be a match for any one of his pursuers, who, fresh, strong in numbers, and eager to take him captive, rushed after him with intense eagerness, which showed how much they valued their prey. White Crane laughed aloud, a laugh of taunting, bitter irony, as he cried, "The Blackfeet are squaws, the Blackfeet are cowardly dogs." Still they rushed on, more eager than ever, their yells mingling with the boiling waters. Suddenly, White Crane plunged, headlong, under water. A yell of horror, terror, and agony burst from the warriors as they vainly strove to turn. Those behind them pressed them on as man clung to man. One gigantic warrior clutched a point of rock, and for an instant they became one dark stationary mass as they clung to the form of their chief. They were in the vortex of the cataract. The current was too impetuous to be stemmed. There was no hope. A loud taunting laugh caused them to raise their eyes to the bank, on which stood the avenger, pointing to the abyss below. A cry then rose so horrible, so piteous, so deathlike, that even White Crane was appalled, and he covered his eyes, as they were drawn over the falls to eternity. Not one was saved. He had his revenge. The place is now deserted. No one will dwell in it. And said Running Fisher, those effigies on the pinnacled rocks over the whirlpool guard the sacred place. White Crane regained his people on the banks of the Snake River. 30 years have passed. He is an old man now and dwells with the Palefaces and hunts for them on the banks of the Columbia River. This story came from the great state of South Dakota, being reported in the Daily Press and Dakotaian of September 24th, 1888. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.